SHRM thanks Lattice for sponsoring this episode of All Things Work. Lattice is building a people-powered future with its all-in-one HR platform. Support your people and scale your business. No trade-offs, no compromise, no regrets. Learn more at lattice.com/no regrets. That's LATTICE.com/no regrets.
Welcome to All Things Work. I'm your host, Ann Sparacco. There is no such thing as an absolutely perfect relationship, even between employees and their managers. Challenges, they're bound to come up. And just like any relationship, it takes two to tango. So for this week's episode, we're digging into practical advice for everyone involved in the workplace. That includes the HR team, managers, and employees coming together to improve their communication and collaboration while supporting a thriving team. And here to guide us through this discussion today is Katherine Mattice, CEO of Civility Partners. Katherine, welcome to All Things Work.
Thanks for having me.
We're happy to have you, and we're excited to jump into this conversation today. So let's start things off with Civility Partners. Can you tell us more about it and its mission and, what brought you to this?
Yeah, Civility Partners is an organizational development consulting firm, and we focus on creating positive, thriving work environments. We are often called in when there's been a disruption of some sort in the culture, maybe a strike, maybe a toxic CEO left and there's some aftermath, or maybe there's been a big conflict that's, created a lot of drama. So we come in, we do workforce surveys. We certainly do lots of strategic planning around the survey data. We do lots of training and also specialize in coaching for leaders who engage in toxic behavior. They've been accused of bullying or even creating a hostile work environment.
So, Katherine, you founded your company after experiencing an unhealthy work environment yourself. So how can you talk about that experience a little bit and how that experience actually influenced your approach to your work in creating a respectful and positive workplace culture?
Sure. So I was a director of human resources for a small organization, found myself working in a toxic work environment, particularly one other director, so my peer, not my boss, was engaged in toxic behavior. I would say he was a workplace bully. I spent a lot of time talking to the president about this behavior and trying to get him to solve it and step in. And the president would say, well, that's just how he is. Leave it alone. Be the bigger person. I started getting my master's degree while I was working there and ended up doing all of my graduate research on the topic of workplace bullying. So I joke, I have a master's degree in workplace bullying. How does that influence me now? I spent a lot of time back then really trying to convince the president to solve this. And I didn't realize the kind of power that I could have had in that scenario. And so I really come from a place of culture is everyone's responsibility. We love to say culture comes from the top. And yeah, in a way, it certainly does. They hold the purse strings, and the president in my situation had, could have solved this for everybody else. But on the flip side, there was a lot of things I could have done myself too, and could have maybe influenced other people to step in. So that's the answer. Culture is everybody's responsibility.
Okay, so let's dive into where the identification of these conflicts generally tend to start from the employee, or in some cases, employees, plural. So what advice would you give to an employee who feels the conflicts they're having with their manager or supervisor need to be addressed in more an official way?
Yeah. So here's the advice I often give. First off, document so that you can really talk about what's happening when you approach the official person you're going to complain to. I would assume HR or a different manager or higher up. What I see a lot is generally we have sexual harassment or discrimination or harassment that's based on a protected characteristic. And somehow anything that's not that is a gray area. Everybody has to get more comfortable with the fact that just because it's not unlawful, it doesn't mean it should happen. So for my advice, taking notes and being able to provide whatever sort of documentation you can is going to be super helpful, because if you go asking for help and you're saying things like, this person's hurting my feelings, or they did this, and you're sort of speaking in abstracts, you're not setting yourself up to get the help that you need. Versus if you can go in and say, I caught Anne gossiping yesterday. I heard her say XYZ, and she was gossiping about this other person. And then a couple of weeks before that, this happened. And so if you can, again, that pattern, really lay out, here's what's happening. And you may not have actual documentation. You may not have that nasty email that they sent you to print out. But if you can keep a journal, that's going to have to do it. And it can help you articulate exactly what it is that you need when you ask for this formal help. And that's my other piece of advice. Be very clear on what you're looking for. Is it just to make HR aware of it? Is it to get help? Is it for them to step in? So be very clear on what it is you're looking for. So you, as the person making this complaint, needs to set the person you're complaining to up for success.
Well, it's not a light thing to do when you're going to HR and you have an issue. You want to make sure that you're showing the evidence of this pattern that you say, because if you're just throwing random things out there and you seem disorganized, it's hard to understand what the actual problem might be. So that's wonderful advice. And I love the example you used. So let's pivot. Speaking of the HR professional, HR department, let's pivot to them and who the employee might have reached out to regarding their concerns. We got some research here at SHRM, as we always do. We love our data. So according to the latest employee mental health research by SHRM, 80% of HR professionals said managing executives and employees' expectations can be very stressful. Additionally, 39% agreed it's hard to bury their emotions and put on a mask when having these difficult conversations. I think many of us can really relate to this just as a worker, but let alone, being the HR department, there's a higher responsibility here. So the HR community is clearly feeling overwhelmed by their workload, leaving little time to address conflicts thoroughly. So what are some clear, straightforward strategies you'd recommend HR professionals take to effectively address an employee's concerns about the conflicts they may be having with their manager or supervisor?
Yeah, my first tip is a proactive approach or preemptive, which is to, in all your spare time, right? You just said HR is a very busy place to be, but get out there and build relationships and partnerships with people. Something I see a lot when I go into, my clients is that HR doesn't necessarily have a relationship with the workforce. So then telling HR something is very stressful. And HR has this reputation that, if it's harassment, then I know to report it. It's in my policy. But for HR to really develop a sort of coaching relationship with whoever they can, as many people as they can, so that if I am feeling not so great about my team, I'm not just letting it get to the point where now I'm filing a complaint and HR has a bunch of stuff to do, where I could be calling and say, this is happening. What do you suggest? What do you think I could do? So that's step number one, is just really positioning your role in the organization as a partner to the employees. The other piece of advice I have is, again, avoid going straight to the facts and is this harassment or not? I find a lot of people feel turned away by HR because it's not harassment, and HR's got a lot on their plate. But if somebody is telling you they don't feel great at work, to ask more perception questions. Well, tell me what's going on. Why do you perceive it that way? Tell me why you perceive that interaction that way. And that's where I operate, right? So for example, when I coach people engaging in bullying or accused of a hostile work environment, I'm not asking investigation questions to find the facts. I'm asking questions like, tell me how this person's leadership is perceived. What would I experience if I was in a meeting with them? So yes, compliance is important and the facts are important, but moving away from that in the right scenarios to uncover more what people need. So that's another big piece of advice. And then finding a solution. I can't tell you how many times we've gotten a client because something was going on for 3, 5, 10 years, and it finally bubbled up to the surface. And the sooner you nip it, the easier it is, the less emotional toll it's going to take on you as an HR professional.
Exactly. And there's a challenge that HR professionals face, and I think a lot of us can relate to this, is that they don't want to make the situation worse. There is always, and it varies based on the situation, how bad the behavior might be. But there's always tension, especially if it's enough to go to your HR department. That means enough is happening or enough has happened for you to approach the situation. So, how do you recommend HR professionals really try to de escalate rather than intensify the situation? And really striking that balance of stepping in and encouraging employees and managers to resolve conflicts.
Yeah. So we're back to that, statement I made that if you have a relationship with people already, all of this is going to be easier. The last thing you want is, if you complain to me as HR and then you're complaining about a specific person and I go to that person and say, this is what I'm hearing, just my presence as HR makes that person very uncomfortable. Whereas if I have a relationship and a reputation, that I am willing to kind of step in and help people solve things, that's going to be a lot less stressful for everybody. The other answer is giving managers the tools to coach people engaging in behaviors. HR does not have to be the repository of all negative things, right? And that's another thing we see. I mean, there's lots of manager training programs out there. I don't see a lot of the topics that we're talking about at Civility Partners. For example, we do a course for managers on how to coach people engaging in toxic behavior. How do you coach that person who's gossiping or leading a clique or, whatever they're doing so that the manager can observe things happening and step in and solve them more easily than it. So, the answer, I guess, is delegation. Don't be the one who's taking in all of this. Get other people's skills so that they can take it in and they can solve it. This is a tip that'll change your life. I'm going to give a script that you can use. So, of course, if you go to someone and say, I'm hearing you're gossiping or being toxic in some way, the person certainly is not going to say, yes, I am that way. And sure, I do that. They're going to justify it or they're going to deny it. Don't engage in a fact battle. They're going to say, who said that? Or, well, that's not what happened in that meeting. And instead of saying, yes, it is, or engaging in a fact battle, what you're going to say is, the perception of you is that you engage in this behavior. I don't know if you do or not. I'm in HR. I don't work with you. But I can tell you that there is this perception from several people around you, and they perceive your behavior this way. And we have to focus on changing that perception. Why do you think people are saying that about you? And that's the coaching that can begin. So HR, of course, really focused on facts, but to say, well, the one fact I have is that there's a perception of you.
You've talked a lot about self-awareness. Even in that example, it's how the HR professional would communicate to engage that self-awareness to kind of get away from that, defense mode, as you would say. So let's say a manager is the one that kind of needs the work in this equation, as far as how they can become more self-aware and learn from their mistakes. What advice would you have for that manager or the HR professional guiding that manager?
Yeah, I'm going to pull something straight out of my coaching program, which is that I interview up to 15 people that this individual works with. And I ask the question, how is this person perceived? Or tell me about their strengths and weaknesses. And again, not facts, just how are you perceived? And I am able to really hold up a mirror with that feedback. So internally, it's going to be a little harder to do something like that and get super honest feedback, but I would still suggest doing it. You're going to get enough information to be able to really hold up the mirror for them and say, this is how you're perceived. It's not just my words. I'm not just sharing with you a couple of complaints I got, that this is really real. And then you get to own the feedback. Even if you don't have the opportunity or don't feel comfortable doing something like that. And you have to go straight from this is how you're perceived. We got to fix it. You have to get them to own that perception of them. And that can be hard. And if they're not willing to own it or explore it, they're probably not right for your organization. I'm just going to say it. So that's part of being in an organization. If somebody or your manager or HR says, you make mistakes, we need you to fix it, or you're late, we need you to fix that. You get to say you're perceived a certain way and it's damaging the organization. You have to be willing to own that you do that. So that's one. The other thing is, after some coaching, if they're not making changes, keeping in mind that bad behavior, toxic behavior, high conflict individuals, that's a performance problem, just like anything else. And so, it's easy if someone is late to say, well, here's the time card. You've clocked in late 10 times. Feels a little fluffier, but it's still very possible to start using your disciplinary procedure if you need to. I've certainly coached people who have been on a PIP because they went through the disciplinary process and now it's changed. We got you a resource or you're out or some other consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my third piece of advice is giving a consequence. And it doesn't have to be improve or you're out. It could be, we're not going to be able to support you moving any higher up in the organization if this is how you're perceived. I know you want to be a manager or a VP. We can't put you in that role if this is how people are perceived. So you get to decide if you want to own that feedback and make change or not.
Exactly. You're given the opportunity for this person to learn and grow, while also trying to say, hey, we can't just give out, excuses or any opportunities just because. So we really need to see this change in order, for you to grow with us, and be a good culture fit. So I love that you brought that up. I think that's really great. In a recent SHRM survey, we found in a polarized society, 59% of workers said incivility causes a decline in employee morale. Now, that number speaks for itself, but it is not really that surprising that it impacts mental health and morale. So do you have any advice for managers on how they could rebuild any trust or broken relationships across the greater team due to this original conflict that may have occurred?
Yeah, conflict runs deep in teams, especially because people may start to pick sides, cliques form around it. Unresolved conflict can actually result in bullying. Sometimes you have two people in conflict and one person or both starts to get more and more aggressive and abrasive in order to win or take their power back, right? My big umbrella piece of advice is that you get what you focus on. So instead of focusing on not having something, not, eliminating the bad behavior or the bad taste people have in their mouths, is to focus on the proactive stuff, focus on what you do want. So a couple things to do if you're a manager of a team and, you want to rebuild your culture inside your team. Ask your team, how do we want to treat each other? How do we want to be at work? And get their feedback and do that in a team meeting. Take notes. And then from there, you'll have a little bit of a code of conduct based on what everybody said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, if your organization has core values and leans into the core values, don't use core values if your organization doesn't use them. But that's another option, is to talk about core values. Hey, our core values are respect or inclusivity or what have you. How can we actively as a team live these core values? Or how can we actively as a team live these things you said you wanted when I asked how you wanted to be treated at work? And same advice I gave to HR, management by walking around. I didn't make that term up. It's been around a long time, but it is interesting how we get so focused on our work, and especially if we're virtual, we're at work and you have stuff to do, and it can be so hard to do that. But that's, you yourself have to build trust and become known as a champion of positivity. And that also means stepping in when you see bad behavior. So, don't go around building up trust if you're witnessing ongoing microaggressions or sarcasm that's inappropriate. Show people that you're an ally and you won't stand for that. Not by saying, I have a zero tolerance policy, but by, coaching, getting in there. So people management, people leaders, it's a tough gig. A lot of employers don't set people up for success on that. Thankfully, there's things like this podcast. So don't wait around for your organization to teach you these things if you feel like you're lacking these skills, right? There's
Exactly.
information everywhere.
And everybody plays a part. So you also have an upcoming book called Navigating a Toxic Environment for Dummies. It's coming out in June. To give people a little bit of a sneak peek and to also leave our audience with a little kind of thought to take with them, what are some key takeaways from your research and writing you want everyone in the workplace to apply today?
Yeah. Well, a lot of what we talked about today is in the book with some scripts and cool things. Again, I think the main message always is that every single one of us is responsible for creating a positive and thriving work environment. If you're an employee, don't wait around for managers or leaders to do some big act in order for you to decide that you're going to step in. The book has a whole section for individual contributors, kind of like, here's what you can do within your power, with the influence that you do have. And so it's important for everyone to be inclusive and aware of how they influence others or how they hurt others. And I always say the key to a civil or inclusive work environment is one where people feel comfortable to talk about things, right? We all misstep. But if I can say, yesterday I saw you do this, or you said this to me and it hurt, and can we talk about it? That is the key. That's going to change the world. That's what we need.
And exercise your empathy muscle. Love it.
Yeah.
All right, Katherine, thank you so much for providing your insight and guiding us through this sometimes complicated discussion. So we appreciate your insight today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. That's going to do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. We have new content out each week with a newsletter and the latest research on these big topics. Just go to shrm.org/allthingswork. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time.
SHRM thanks Lattice for sponsoring this episode of All Things Work. Learn more about Lattice at lattice.com/no regrets. That's LATTICE.com/no regrets.
SHRM.